Two twin sisters go into labor on the same day, side by side, ready to welcome their babies into the world. But the moment their newborns are placed in their arms, everything shatters. The black twin delivers a blonde-haired, fair-skinned baby. The white twin gives birth to a child with deep brown skin. Confusion turns to panic, and when the doctor sees the results, his face goes ghostly pale. What he finds is so shocking, so impossible, it threatens to tear families apart. Were the babies switched? Was there betrayal? Or is the truth something even more unthinkable? Stay with us as this gripping tale unravels secrets buried for decades. Secrets that could change everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Rachel's backyard, painting the wooden deck in warm golden hues. The sisters sat side by side in comfortable deck chairs, their swollen bellies making them look even more identical than usual. A gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of Rachel's late-blooming roses, mixing with the steam from their cups of chamomile tea. "Remember when we switched places in Mrs. Peterson's class?" Naomi chuckled, running her hand over her 8-month bump. "You were terrible at pretending to be me." Rachel smiled, adjusting the cushion behind her back. "That's because you're impossible to imitate. Nobody else would dare tell Tommy Jenkins he was being a royal pain in the behind for picking on me." "Well, somebody had to stand up to that bully," Naomi said, reaching over to squeeze her sister's hand. "Though I have to admit, watching you try to match my swagger was pretty entertaining." Rachel's laugh turned into a worried sigh as she glanced at the stack of parenting books visible through the sliding glass door. "I've been reading everything I can get my hands on about childbirth and parenting. David thinks I'm overdoing it with all the color-coded birth plans and emergency contact lists." "Of course you are," Naomi teased. "But that's who you are, sis. You've always been the prepared one." Rachel's eyes grew misty. "What if being prepared isn't enough? What if I'm not a good mother?" Naomi set down her tea and turned to face her sister. "Hey, look at me. You're going to be amazing. You've got Mom's heart. Remember how she always knew exactly what we needed? Whether it was a hug or a kick in the pants?" The sound of car doors closing interrupted their conversation. David appeared around the corner of the house, his tie loosened after a long day at the office. He crossed the deck to plant a gentle kiss on Rachel's cheek. "How are my favorite sisters-in-law?" he asked, though his eyes were fixed lovingly on Rachel. "Still pregnant," Naomi quipped. "Ready for double trouble, David?" Marcus emerged behind David, his work boots clomping on the deck stairs. Despite his imposing frame, he moved with surprising gentleness as he approached Naomi, wrapping her in a warm embrace. "Speaking of trouble," Marcus said, "I heard you telling someone at the grocery store yesterday that you're going to be the cool mom." "Well, somebody has to balance out Rachel's inevitable PTA presidency and organic-only snack policies," Naomi shot back with a grin. Rachel protested, "I am not going to be that strict." "Oh, really?" Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Says the woman who already has a spreadsheet for tummy time scheduling?" The group burst into laughter, and even Rachel had to admit there was some truth to her sister's teasing. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the deck, the conversation flowed easily between them, filled with hopes and dreams for the future. "No matter what happens," Naomi declared, patting her belly, "these babies will bring us even closer." Later that night, in their respective homes, both sisters were jolted awake by sharp pains. Rachel gasped, her hand instinctively reaching for David in their darkened bedroom. Across town, Naomi sat up abruptly in bed, the sudden movement causing Marcus to stir beside her. The sisters, connected by an invisible thread even in separate locations, shared the same realization. Their babies were coming. The hospital parking lot lay quiet under flickering streetlights, the pre-dawn air crisp and still. 2 cars pulled in almost simultaneously, their headlights cutting through the darkness. From one, David practically jumped out, his hands shaking as he helped Rachel from the passenger seat. In the other car, Marcus guided Naomi with steady hands, though his tight jaw betrayed his anxiety. "I need a wheelchair, my wife's in labor." David's voice echoed across the empty lot, while Rachel leaned against the car, breathing heavily through another contraction. Naomi, watching her sister from a few spaces away, gripped Marcus's arm. "I'm walking in," she insisted, then winced as a sharp pain hit. "Okay, maybe not so fast." The automatic doors whooshed open, releasing a wave of antiseptic-scented air. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the sisters' pale faces. A nurse at the admission desk looked up, her eyes widening at the sight of two heavily pregnant women arriving together. "They're twins," Marcus explained, helping Naomi to a chair while David filled out paperwork with trembling hands. The nurse chuckled, already reaching for admission forms. "Twins giving birth on the same day? That's definitely a first for us." Rachel's grip on David's hand tightened as another contraction hit. "David," she gasped, "I don't think I can wait much longer." A wheelchair appeared, pushed by a young nurse with efficient movements. "Let's get you settled, Mrs. Bennett. How far apart are the contractions?" "About 3 minutes," David answered, his voice cracking slightly. In the adjacent chair, Naomi breathed steadily through her own contraction, her knuckles white against Marcus's arm. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her face told a different story. "Just need to focus on the breathing exercises." The maternity ward buzzed with quiet activity as nurses made their morning rounds. Rachel was wheeled into her room first, with David hovering nervously beside her. The nurses worked quickly, hooking up monitors and checking vital signs. 8 centimeters already, the nurse announced after checking Rachel. "This baby's eager to meet you." Naomi was settled in the next room, still maintaining her composure despite the increasing pain. Marcus stood by her side, his usual stoic expression softened with concern as he watched her grip the bed rails. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he whispered, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. "Yes, I do," she replied through gritted teeth. "It's kind of my thing." Suddenly, Rachel's voice pierced the relative quiet of the ward. The sound of her sister's pain made Naomi flinch, her own contractions intensifying in response. "Push, Mrs. Bennett," the doctor's voice carried through the thin wall. "You're doing great." Naomi closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing as the nurses monitored her progress. The beeping of machines and the bustling of medical staff created a symphony of hospital sounds around them. 6 centimeters, Naomi's nurse reported. "You're progressing well, but your sister might beat you to the finish line." Another scream from Rachel's room confirmed this assessment. David's voice could be heard offering encouragement, though it shook with nervous energy. The medical team quickly prepped Rachel's room for delivery, their movements precise and practiced. Through the wall, Naomi could hear the increasing urgency in the doctor's instructions. Rachel gripped David's hand as they wheeled her toward the delivery room, her face contorted in pain. "I can't do this," she gasped. "Yes, you can, sweetheart," David assured her, his earlier panic replaced by determined support. "You're the strongest person I know." In her room, Naomi breathed through another contraction, knowing her turn would come soon. Marcus held her hand, his steady presence anchoring her as the pain intensified. The delivery room buzzed with focused energy as Rachel gripped the bed rails, her knuckles white with effort. Sweat trickled down her temples, and her dark hair clung to her forehead in damp strands. The overhead lights seemed impossibly bright, casting sharp shadows across the faces of the medical team surrounding her. "You're doing great, sweetheart," David whispered, his voice trembling slightly as he held her hand. His usually neat button-down shirt was wrinkled, and dark patches of perspiration showed under his arms. "Just a little more." The nurse's encouraging voice cut through Rachel's exhausted haze. "One more big push, Mrs. Bennett. Your baby's almost here." Rachel gathered her remaining strength, squeezing David's hand so hard he winced. With a deep breath, she bore down, letting out a primal cry that echoed off the sterile walls. The pressure built until she thought she couldn't take any more, and then suddenly, release. The sound of a baby's first cry filled the room, strong and healthy. Rachel fell back against the pillows, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. She could hear David's relieved laugh, feel his lips press against her forehead. "It's a boy," the doctor announced triumphantly, lifting the squirming infant. Rachel's heart swelled with love as she reached out her arms, eager to hold her son for the first time. But as the nurse placed the baby on her chest, something made her pause. Her eyes widened as she took in her child's features, deep brown skin so different from her own fair complexion, and tiny dark curls already visible on his perfect head. The room grew eerily quiet. Rachel's hands trembled as she touched her son's cheek, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. She looked up at David, seeking reassurance, explanation, anything, but found only shock written across his features. His face had drained of color, his mouth hanging slightly open as he stared at their child. The medical staff busied themselves with their tasks, their movements suddenly stiff and awkward as they avoided making eye contact with the new parents. The silence in the room felt heavy, suffocating, broken only by the continued cries of their newborn son. Through the wall, they could hear the sounds from the next delivery room. Naomi's voice carried clearly, a long, powerful scream of determination that ended in a gasp. The cry of another baby joined the chorus, sharp and clear. Rachel held her son closer, protective instincts already kicking in despite her confusion. She could hear the medical team in Naomi's room moving about, but something seemed off. There was a strange tension in the voices that filtered through the wall, an unusual hesitation in the typical congratulatory words. The doctor's voice in the next room sounded strained, uncertain. The usual efficient movement of the medical team seemed to have stalled. Through the thin hospital walls, Rachel could hear Naomi's tired but joyful voice, "Let me see my baby." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel looked down at her own child, who had quieted and was now blinking up at her with dark eyes. In the next room, she could hear Naomi's voice again, this time with an edge of concern. "Doctor? Is everything okay?" But the doctor didn't respond immediately. The quiet stretched on, broken only by the soft sounds of the medical equipment and the distant bustle of the hospital corridor. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Naomi lay in the delivery bed, her chest rising and falling with exhausted breaths. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead, and her hospital gown clung to her damp skin. She held out her arms, eager to hold her newborn, but something felt off in the room's atmosphere. "Let me see my baby," she said, her voice hoarse from the hours of labor. The medical team exchanged glances, their faces tight with concern. The doctor, still cradling the infant, seemed frozen in place. Marcus stepped closer to the bed, his work-roughened hands gripping the metal rail. "What's wrong?" he demanded, his deep voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Is something wrong with our baby?" A young nurse with kind eyes whispered something to the doctor, who gave a slight shake of his head. His hands trembled slightly as he held the swaddled infant. The tension in the room grew thicker with each passing second. "Doctor?" Naomi's voice cracked, fear creeping in. "Please, I need to hold my baby." Finally, moving as if in slow motion, the doctor stepped forward and placed the bundle in Naomi's waiting arms. The moment she looked down at her child's face, she felt the world tilt on its axis. The baby was beautiful, perfectly formed with delicate features, but nothing like what she'd expected. Instead of the olive complexion she and Marcus shared, her child's skin was fair as morning light. Wisps of golden curls peeked out from beneath the hospital cap, and when the baby's eyes fluttered open, they were a startling shade of blue. Naomi's words trailed off as she stared at her child, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. She looked up at Marcus, seeking answers, but found only confusion and shock on his face. Marcus took a step back from the bed, his expression unreadable. His usually warm brown eyes had turned cold and distant as he stared at the baby. The muscles in his jaw worked silently, and his hands had fallen away from the bed rail. Through the wall, they could hear movement in the next room where Rachel lay with her own newborn. The sound of quiet crying filtered through, not the wails of a baby, but the soft sobs of a grown woman. The doctor cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. His face was pale, and he kept glancing between Naomi and Marcus as if trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "Mrs. Carter," he began, his voice carefully controlled, "I need to discuss something with you and your husband." A nurse hurried into the room, her face flushed. She whispered something urgent to the doctor, who nodded gravely. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. "What's happening?" Naomi demanded, instinctively holding her baby closer. "What's wrong with Rachel? What's wrong with our babies?" The doctor adjusted his glasses, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. "Mrs. Carter, we need to run some tests. Standard procedure in unusual circumstances." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We'll need to take blood samples from both you and the baby." In the next room, Rachel's crying grew louder. Through the thin wall, they could hear David's voice, tight with emotion, asking questions they couldn't quite make out. Naomi looked down at her baby again, touching one soft, pale cheek with trembling fingers. The infant's blue eyes stared back at her, so different from her own dark ones. She felt Marcus's absence like a physical ache as he remained rooted in place several feet from the bed. The doctor's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. "We need to run some tests." The fluorescent lights continued their steady hum, casting harsh shadows across the faces of everyone in the room, while next door, Rachel's sobs echoed through the wall. The midday sun streamed through the hospital room's blinds, casting harsh stripes across the sterile floor. Naomi lay propped up in her bed, her dark curls a mess against the white pillow, while her fair-skinned newborn slept peacefully in the clear bassinet beside her. Her fingers gripped the sheets so tightly her knuckles turned white. Marcus stood by the window, his broad shoulders tense, creating a wall between himself and his wife. The silence in the room felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone. The doctor cleared his throat, shuffling through papers on his clipboard. "We're running some additional tests to be certain," he said, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. A nurse wheeled Rachel into the room, her own baby nestled in her arms. David followed, his face a mask of stone, his steps mechanical. Rachel's eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale against her dark hair. The contrast between her complexion and her baby's rich brown skin seemed even more striking in the harsh hospital lighting. David's gaze landed on Naomi's baby, and his eyes widened slightly before darting back to his own child. His hands curled into tight fists at his sides, and his jaw clenched visibly. The tension in the room built like a gathering storm until Marcus broke the silence. His voice came out low but firm, each word falling like a hammer blow. "Naomi, are you sure this is my child?" Naomi's face drained of color. Her lips parted in shock, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. "Excuse me?" Marcus shifted his weight, still not looking directly at her, his eyes fixed on the baby's fair skin and golden curls. "Just tell me the truth. Did you... I just had your baby and you're accusing me?" Naomi's voice cracked like thunder, making both babies stir in their sleep. Her whole body shook with rage and disbelief. Across the room, David turned slowly toward Rachel, his expression unreadable but his eyes filled with the same suspicion that Marcus had voiced. "Rachel," his voice cracked slightly, "did you..." Rachel clutched her baby closer to her chest, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "Oh my God, David, no!" Her voice came out as a whisper, thick with hurt and shock. Marcus paced the small space near the window, his hands rubbing his temples. "This isn't making sense." His voice held a note of desperation now, as if he was trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "No, it doesn't," David agreed, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "But I need answers." He stood rigid, his shoulders squared as if preparing for a fight. The doctor raised his hand, commanding attention. "Enough!" His authoritative tone cut through the charged atmosphere. "The only way to resolve this is with DNA testing. We're running them now." The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft breathing of the two newborns, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the consultation room's blinds, casting long shadows across the doctor's desk. The manila folder lying there seemed to pulse with untold secrets. Naomi and Rachel sat shoulder to shoulder in uncomfortable chairs, their fingers intertwined so tightly their knuckles had turned white. Behind them, Marcus and David stood like sentinels, arms crossed, faces etched with worry. The doctor adjusted his glasses, his movements deliberately slow. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching like an hour. "I want to start by saying," the doctor began, his voice gentle but firm, "the babies were not switched at birth." Rachel let out a sharp breath, her shoulders dropping slightly. For just a moment, relief flickered across her face like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Then what's happening?" Naomi's voice cracked, betraying her usual confidence. The doctor opened the folder with careful movements. "We tested for biological parentage." He glanced at Naomi and Marcus first, his eyes scanning the paper. "Marcus, you are the father." Naomi turned to Marcus, her chin lifted defiantly. "I told you." The words came out barely above a whisper, heavy with hurt. Marcus uncrossed his arms, running a hand through his hair. His exhale was audible, but he remained silent, shame coloring his features. The doctor's attention shifted to the next page. The pause stretched longer this time, making Rachel grip Naomi's hand even tighter. "David." Another pause. "You are the father." Rachel slumped back in her chair, her free hand trembling as she pushed hair from her face. "Then how is this possible?" Her voice quavered. "How can our babies look like they belong to each other?" David swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Why do our kids look like they belong to the other?" His voice was tight, controlled, but barely. The doctor removed his glasses, placing them carefully on the desk. "Naomi, Rachel ... He took a deep breath. "You're not identical twins." Rachel's face drained of color so quickly she looked like she might faint. "What?" "In fact," the doctor continued, his words measured and careful, "one of you is not biologically related to your parents at all." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Marcus and David exchanged stunned looks while Naomi blinked rapidly, as if trying to clear her vision. "That's not possible," Naomi said, but her voice lacked its usual certainty. Her hand trembled in Rachel's grip. The doctor slid a piece of paper forward on his desk, the harsh fluorescent lights reflecting off its glossy surface. "I ran an additional test after seeing the results." His voice was heavy with the weight of his next words. "One of you was switched at birth." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel's breath came in short, sharp gasps. Naomi sat perfectly still, like a statue carved from stone. Behind them, David pressed his palms against the wall, as if needing its support to remain standing. Marcus had gone completely pale, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Rachel turned to Naomi, tears spilling onto her cheeks, leaving glistening trails in their wake. Their whole world, their shared history, their identical features, everything they'd known about themselves, suddenly felt like a house of cards collapsing. Naomi's lips trembled as she whispered the words that would change everything. Then, who am I? The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the living room windows of the Carter family home. The familiar space, usually warm and inviting with its worn leather furniture and family photos covering the walls, felt different today. The air was thick with unspoken words and buried secrets. Naomi and Rachel sat rigidly on the brown leather couch, their bodies tense. Rachel's eyes were red and puffy from crying, while Naomi's jaw was set in a hard line. Across from them, their father Henry perched on the edge of his favorite armchair, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. Grandmother Evelyn stood by the fireplace, her thin fingers wrapped around her wooden cane, her eyes fixed on the family photos on the mantel. "Tell us the truth." Naomi's voice cut through the silence like a knife. Her hands trembled in her lap, but her voice remained steady, determined. The ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner seemed deafening. Henry shifted in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him. His shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible weight. "I always knew something wasn't right," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel's sharp intake of breath broke the stillness. "You knew?" Her voice cracked with disbelief and betrayal. Evelyn's knuckles whitened around her cane as she continued staring at the ground. "I didn't know. Not exactly." Her words came out strained, as if each one caused her physical pain. Naomi leaned forward, her dark eyes blazing. Her voice shook with emotion as she demanded, "Then tell us what you did know." Evelyn's shoulders sagged. She looked older suddenly, more fragile than either sister had ever seen her. She slowly made her way to the armchair opposite Henry and lowered herself into it. "When your mother gave birth, there were complications." She paused, swallowing hard. "I was told I couldn't see you both right away." The sisters exchanged glances. Rachel wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand while Naomi's fingers dug into the couch cushions. Later that night, Evelyn continued, her voice growing distant as if lost in the memory. "Something felt wrong, but I had no proof." The afternoon light caught the tears now freely flowing down Rachel's cheeks. Naomi reached for her sister's hand, gripping it tightly. "I pushed it away," Evelyn admitted, each word heavy with regret. "I told myself it was just in my head." Rachel suddenly burst into tears, her whole body shaking with sobs. "So you let us live a lie?" The words came out between gasps, raw with pain and accusation. Henry reached toward his daughter but stopped short, his hand hanging helplessly in the air between them. The family photos on the walls seemed to mock them now, smiling faces capturing moments of joy that suddenly felt hollow. Evelyn closed her eyes, her face lined with decades of carried guilt. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. It was too late. By the time I found the courage to question it, it was already too late. The words hung in the air like smoke, choking them all with the weight of 32 years of silence. The afternoon sun continued its slow descent, casting longer shadows across the room, as if trying to hide the truth that had finally emerged from the darkness. The soft glow of Naomi's laptop screen cast shadows across her living room. Outside, crickets chirped in the darkness, a stark contrast to the tension-filled silence within. Scattered papers and old photo albums covered every surface of the coffee table, creating a maze of memories that no longer felt quite real. Rachel sat cross-legged on the floor, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard. Her eyes were red-rimmed but focused as she searched through digitized hospital records from 3 decades ago. Naomi hunched over a stack of baby pictures, comparing them side by side, looking for any hint that might have given away the truth all these years. David occupied one end of the plush beige couch, his tie loosened and shirt sleeves rolled up. He kept rubbing his temples, as if trying to massage away the headache that had settled in hours ago. Marcus stood by the window, his broad shoulders tense, occasionally glancing at the women but mostly staring out into the darkness. "How do you even find something like this?" Marcus's voice was rough with exhaustion. "It's not like there's a guidebook for discovering you're not who you thought you were." Naomi didn't respond, too engrossed in the photos spread before her. Something caught her eye, making her breath catch. Her hand froze mid-motion as she stared at the screen. "Rachel!" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Look at this." Rachel pushed herself up from the floor, wincing slightly as her muscles protested. She leaned over Naomi's shoulder, squinting at the screen. "What is it?" Naomi's finger trembled slightly as she pointed to an old newspaper article. The bold headline seemed to leap off the screen. "Babies mixed up at birth? Hospital scandal from 30 years ago. Resurfaces." The room grew impossibly quiet. Even the crickets outside seemed to pause their evening song. David straightened on the couch, his fatigue forgotten. Marcus turned from the window, taking a few steps closer. Rachel's hand gripped Naomi's shoulder, her knuckles white. The article's opening paragraph glowed accusingly on the screen. Memorial Hospital faces serious allegations of negligence following claims of multiple infant mix-ups during the summer of... "That's our hospital," Rachel whispered, her voice cracking. "That's where we were born." Naomi scrolled down, her eyes scanning the text rapidly. The article detailed allegations of understaffing, overworked nurses, and a series of near misses with infant identification. Several families had come forward with concerns, though nothing had ever been proven. "Look at the date," Naomi said, her finger tapping the screen. "This was published just 2 months after we were born." David stood up, moving closer to read over their shoulders. His professional instincts kicked in. Were there any lawsuits? Any formal investigations? "I'm looking," Rachel murmured, already typing furiously on her own laptop. "There has to be more information somewhere." Marcus finally joined them, his presence solid and grounding despite his earlier doubts. "Maybe we should contact the reporter who wrote this. They might have sources, leads." Naomi stared at the screen, her reflection ghostly in its blue light. The weight of their situation pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. Everything she thought she knew about herself, her identity, her family history, even her medical background, was suddenly questionable. "We need to find out who we really are," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications and unanswered questions. Rachel reached for her sister's hand, or was she really her sister at all? Their fingers intertwined automatically, a gesture of comfort they'd shared thousands of times before. Now, even this familiar touch felt different, charged with uncertainty and fear, but also determination. Early morning sunlight crept through Naomi's living room windows, casting long shadows across the mess of papers and photographs scattered everywhere. Neither sister had slept, their eyes red-rimmed but determined as they continued their search for answers. Coffee cups littered the room, testament to their overnight vigil. Naomi paced back and forth, her steps quick and agitated. Every few minutes she'd stop to peer over Rachel's shoulder at the laptop screen, then resume her restless movement. The sound of her footsteps created a steady rhythm against the hardwood floor. "There has to be something," she muttered, running her fingers through her disheveled hair. "We can't be the only ones this happened to." Rachel sat cross-legged on the floor, her back against the couch, typing furiously. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion, but her fingers never stopped moving across the keyboard. Marcus sat quietly in an armchair, watching his wife pace, his expression torn between concern and lingering doubt. David leaned against the wall, sipping his fourth cup of coffee. His skeptical eyes followed Naomi's movement, but he remained engaged, occasionally offering suggestions for search terms. "Try looking up legal cases from that year," he said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Naomi stopped at the coffee table, picking up an old family photo album. She flipped through the pages slowly, comparing baby pictures. Something caught her eye, making her frown deeply. She held up two photographs side by side. "Rachel, look at this," she said, her voice tight. "This baby picture of you. You've got Dad's light skin tone, but mine." She swallowed hard. "Mine looks different, like it could belong to someone else entirely." Rachel rubbed her tired eyes, squinting at the pictures. Before she could respond, something on her screen made her gasp loudly. "Naomi, look at this." Everyone crowded around as Rachel turned her laptop around. The headline blazed across the screen. "Maternity ward under investigation. Families suspect babies switched." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes widening. "That's the hospital where you were born." "The article doesn't mention any names," David said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "But the timing, if this was happening when you were born." Naomi's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The morning light caught the determination in her eyes as she stared at the article. "We need to find out more. There has to be more information somewhere." Rachel scrolled through the article, her hands shaking slightly. "It mentions multiple families were affected, but the hospital settled out of court. All the records were sealed." "Of course they were," Naomi said bitterly. She picked up her phone, her jaw set with determination. "We need access to those hospital records. If no one's going to tell us the truth, we'll find it ourselves." The weight of their discovery hung heavy in the room. The morning sun continued to rise outside, but inside Naomi's apartment, time seemed to stand still as the sisters faced the possibility that their entire lives had been built on a mistake, or worse, a cover-up. The hospital archives office felt like stepping into a tomb. Cold fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across rows of metal filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling. The air smelled of dust and old paper, making Rachel sneeze as they entered. Naomi strode purposefully to the front desk, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. Her sister followed close behind, wringing her hands nervously. The administrator, Mrs. Collins, peered at them over wire-rimmed glasses, her expression already showing resistance before they'd even spoken. "Can I help you?" Mrs. Collins asked, her tone suggesting she'd rather not. "We need to see birth records from 30 years ago," Naomi said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Specifically from March 15th. Mrs. Collins's lips pressed into a thin line. "Those records are confidential. You'd need proper authorization and—" "Please," Rachel interrupted, her voice cracking. "This isn't just curiosity. This is our lives." Tears welled up in her eyes as she gripped the edge of the desk. "We just found out we might have been switched at birth. We need to know the truth." The administrator's expression softened slightly, but she shook her head. "I'm sorry, but those records are confidential. Hospital policy is very clear about this." Naomi felt anger rising in her chest. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, a young nurse who had been organizing files nearby approached them. Her name tag read, Clara. "Excuse me," Clara said softly, touching Naomi's arm. "Could I speak with you both for a moment?" She led them to a quiet corner, glancing over her shoulder to make sure Mrs. Collins wasn't watching. "I heard what you said about being switched at birth. My grandmother worked in this hospital back then." Rachel's breath caught. "She did?" Clara nodded, lowering her voice further. "She used to tell me stories about incidents, babies being misplaced, but no one ever got proof. The hospital covered everything up." "So it's true?" Rachel gripped Naomi's arm so tight it hurt. "It really happened?" Clara's eyes darted around the room before she pulled a small notepad from her pocket. "If your family was affected, there might be a way to find out." Her pen scratched against the paper as she wrote. "The nurse who worked that night, was she still alive?" Naomi's heart pounded as Clara tore off the paper and carefully slid it across the counter. An address was written in neat handwriting, along with a name. "She might be willing to talk," Clara whispered. "She's been carrying this guilt for years." Rachel's hands trembled as she took the paper, staring at it like it might disappear. Naomi read the address over her shoulder, memorizing every detail. They thanked Clara, who quickly returned to her work before Mrs. Collins could notice. As they walked toward the exit, the sisters exchanged glances. Naomi saw her own mix of fear and determination reflected in Rachel's eyes. "Let's go," Naomi whispered, gripping her sister's hand. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Rachel sat on her living room couch, gently rocking her newborn son. The soft glow of a table lamp cast shadows across the room, making everything feel smaller, more confined. Her baby's dark curls reminded her of the impossible situation they were in, and her heart ached with each passing moment of silence. In the kitchen, David moved around mechanically, loading the dishwasher with more force than necessary. He hadn't properly looked at her all day, and the distance between them felt like an ocean growing wider by the minute. Rachel watched him through the doorway, her throat tight with unshed tears. The baby stirred in her arms, making small noises that usually would have made David rush over. Now he just tensed his shoulders and kept his back turned. "We need to talk," Rachel finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. David's movement stopped. He gripped the edge of the counter, exhaling sharply as he rubbed his forehead with his free hand. "I don't even know where to start." The pain in his voice made Rachel's chest tighten. "You don't trust me anymore." It wasn't a question. She could see it in every avoided glance, every stiff movement. David turned slowly, his eyes filled with a sadness that broke her heart. "I don't know what to believe." He gestured helplessly at their son. "Look at him, Rachel. How am I supposed to make sense of this?" Before Rachel could respond, rapid knocking at the front door made them both jump. Through the window, they could see Naomi's familiar silhouette, rain pouring down around her. Rachel carefully stood up, cradling the baby as she opened the door. Naomi burst in, water dripping from her coat and hair, her expression unreadable, but her eyes wild with emotion. "I need to see Marcus," she announced without preamble, running a hand through her wet hair. Rachel exchanged a worried glance with David. He hasn't answered your calls? Naomi's face hardened, her jaw clenching. Number he won't pick up. Won't answer texts. His truck wasn't at home. She paced the living room, leaving wet footprints on the carpet. But I'm not letting him walk away. Not like this. Naomi, Rachel started, but her sister cut her off. Don't tell me to give him space or time or whatever. Naomi's voice cracked slightly. He's my husband, the father of my child. He doesn't get to just disappear because things got complicated. David shifted uncomfortably in the kitchen doorway. Maybe he needs time to process. Process what? Naomi whirled on him. That I've been faithful? That I carried his child for 9 months? That some hospital mix-up 30 years ago doesn't change who we are now? Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room for a brief moment. The baby started crying, and Rachel bounced him gently, trying to soothe him. Naomi's expression softened as she looked at her nephew, then at her own fair-skinned baby sleeping in the carrier she'd brought. Our babies deserve better than this, she said quietly. We all do. She pulled her car keys from her pocket, gripping them tightly. I'm going to find him. The determination in her voice left no room for argument. Rain pelted against the windows, matching the storm of emotions in the room. Rachel watched her sister, recognizing the fierce look in her eyes, the same one she'd had when they were kids, and she'd decided something was worth fighting for. The streetlights cast long shadows across Marcus's apartment building as Naomi stood at his door, her clothes damp from the drizzling rain. Her heart pounded as she knocked, each rap against the wood echoing her determination. Water dripped from her hair onto her shoulders, but she barely noticed. She had more important things on her mind than being wet. Inside his apartment, Marcus sat in semi-darkness, an empty whiskey glass catching what little light filtered through the windows. The knock made him flinch. He knew who it was. He'd been avoiding her calls all day, but Naomi wasn't the type to give up easily. After the third round of knocking, Marcus finally opened the door. He stood there silently, his usually confident posture now defeated and uncertain. Naomi didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past him, her shoes squeaking against the hardwood floor. Are you seriously hiding from me? Her voice cracked with hurt and anger. The apartment smelled of whiskey and takeout, telling her everything she needed to know about how he'd spent his day. Marcus closed the door slowly, then ran a hand over his tired face. Dark circles under his eyes matched the heaviness in his voice. I don't know what to say, Naomi. The words sparked something in her. She slammed her hand down on the nearby table, making the empty glass jump. How about, I'm sorry for treating my wife like a liar. Marcus winced at the sound, at her words, at everything. He leaned against the wall, looking more lost than she'd ever seen him. I don't know how to process this, he admitted quietly. Naomi felt some of her anger dissolve at the raw honesty in his voice. Her expression softened as she took a step toward him. Then let me help you, she said, her voice breaking. We're supposed to face things together, Marcus. That's what marriage means. Across town, Rachel sat in her dimly lit home office, the blue light from her laptop screen illuminating her focused expression. David had gone to bed early, the weight of their earlier conversation still hanging heavy between them. Their baby slept peacefully in the nursery while she searched for answers. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard as she typed in the name Clara had given them. The search results loaded, and suddenly, there it was. A newspaper article from just a few years ago. Rachel leaned closer to the screen, her breath catching in her throat. The article showed a photo of an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair. The caption read, Retired nurse Esther Collins celebrates 50 years of medical service. Rachel's hands began to shake as she scanned the article. It mentioned Esther's long career at the same hospital where she and Naomi were born. Naomi? Rachel whispered to herself, her heart racing. I think I found her. The woman in the photo seemed to look right through the screen, as if she held all the answers they'd been searching for. With trembling fingers, Rachel reached for her phone, She needed to tell Naomi right away. As she dialed her sister's number, she could hardly contain the mix of excitement and fear coursing through her. This could be it, the key to unlocking their true identities. The phone began to ring, its sound cutting through the quiet night. At Marcus's apartment, Naomi's phone lit up in her pocket, playing her familiar ringtone. The screen displayed Rachel's name, interrupting the intense moment between her and Marcus. The morning air felt heavy as Naomi pulled her car into the parking lot of Sunrise Haven Care Home. The old brick building stood like a sentinel against the gray sky, its weathered walls telling stories of decades past. Rachel sat in the passenger seat, clutching a wrinkled newspaper article so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Neither sister had slept much. Dark circles rimmed their eyes and coffee cups littered Naomi's cup holders. They'd spent the night trading theories and fears, their phones buzzing with ignored calls from Marcus and David. "Are we really ready for this?" Rachel's voice quivered as she studied the photograph of Esther Collins one more time. Naomi's hands tightened on the steering wheel until her knuckles matched her sister's. "We don't have a choice." She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. "Our whole lives, everything we thought we knew, it all comes down to what's behind those doors." The sisters made their way through the entrance where the sharp smell of disinfectant mixed with the scent of morning coffee. A kind-faced nurse greeted them at the front desk, checking their names against a visitor log. "Mrs. Collins is having a good day," the nurse said as she led them down a carpeted hallway lined with generic landscape paintings. "She's in her usual spot by the window." The walk felt endless. Rachel reached for Naomi's hand, squeezing it tight. They'd held hands like this countless times before, sharing secrets and fears, but never anything this big. When they reached room 312, the nurse knocked softly before pushing the door open. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, falling across an elderly woman sitting in a worn armchair. Esther Collins sat perfectly still, her thin frame wrapped in a pale blue sweater, her white hair neatly combed. She seemed lost in thought as she gazed out at the garden below. Rachel cleared her throat softly. "Mrs. Collins?" The old woman turned, and her sharp blue eyes immediately fixed on Naomi. There was something unsettling in that gaze. Recognition, guilt, and something deeper that made Naomi's stomach clench. "Do you?" Naomi's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. She swallowed hard and tried again. "Do you know who I am?" Esther's shoulders slumped slightly and she looked away toward the window again. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, heavy with unspoken truths. "I knew this day would come," Esther finally said, her voice surprisingly strong despite her frail appearance. "I've waited 32 years for someone to walk through that door." Rachel's breath caught audibly. "So it's true?" Esther turned back to them, her eyes now glistening with unshed tears as she met Naomi's gaze. "You were never supposed to be taken." Her words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through the quiet room. Naomi's legs felt weak. She sank into the chair across from Esther, leaning forward. Her whole body trembled with the weight of what she was about to learn. Everything she thought she knew about herself, her family, her identity, her life, balanced on the edge of this moment. "Tell me everything," Naomi said, her voice stronger now, determined to finally hear the truth. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Esther Collins' room, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. The elderly woman sat in her rocking chair, her hands trembling slightly as she faced the two sisters. Around them, yellowed photographs lined the walls, silent witnesses to this moment of revelation. Naomi perched on the edge of a small wooden chair, while Rachel stood behind her, one hand resting protectively on her sister's shoulder. The ticking of an old clock on the wall marked each heavy second of silence. Finally, Esther spoke, her voice carrying the weight of decades of guilt. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. She wrung her hands together, her wedding ring loose on her thin finger. 2 mothers, 2 babies born minutes apart. It was a busy night, the staff was short, the babies weren't labeled right away. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. "And I was one of them." Esther nodded slowly, pain etched across her weathered face. By the time we realized it was too late, one of the families had already left. The paperwork was finalized. She looked down at her lap. No one wanted a scandal. Rachel's voice came out barely above a whisper. Which one of us? Esther's eyes fixed on Naomi, filled with unshed tears. Your real mother never knew you were taken from her. Tears spilled down Naomi's cheeks, leaving glistening trails on her face. She didn't bother to wipe them away. Who is she? The old nurse turned to a small drawer beside her chair. Her hand shook as she pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age, its corners soft and worn. The paper inside crackled as she carefully unfolded it. I've carried this burden for 32 years, Esther said, her voice breaking. I couldn't make it right then, but maybe. She held out the paper, where a name and address were written in faded blue ink. Esther Johnson, last known address, Atlanta, Georgia. Naomi reached for the paper with trembling fingers. The name seemed to blur before her eyes as fresh tears welled up. I have to find her. Rachel squeezed her sister's shoulder tighter, her own tears falling freely now. The weight of the truth settled over the room like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe. Sunlight continued to stream through the window, dust motes dancing in the golden beams while three women sat in silence, each processing the magnitude of this revelation. The clock on the wall kept ticking, marking the moments between Naomi's old life and whatever would come next. She stared at the name on the paper, Esther Johnson, her real mother's name. A woman who had never known her baby had been taken, who had lived for 32 years wondering what had happened to her child. The truth they'd been searching for was finally in their hands, written on a piece of paper that had waited decades to be discovered. Naomi clutched it like a lifeline, this tangible connection to her past, to the mother she'd never known existed until now. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Naomi's apartment windows, but the darkness inside seemed to come from somewhere deeper. Naomi sat on her couch, the piece of paper with Esther Johnson's name clutched in her trembling hands. Marcus stood by the window, his silhouette rigid against the fading light. So what now, Naomi? You just go off to find this woman? Marcus's voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. Naomi wiped her tears with the back of her hand, trying to steady her voice. She's my mother, Marcus. Marcus scoffed, shaking his head. His fingers drummed against his crossed arms. And what does that make the woman who raised you? The one who packed your lunches, kissed your scrapes, stayed up all night when you had fever? Don't you dare. Naomi's voice cracked with emotion. I love my mother. Nothing will ever change that. But don't I deserve to know where I came from? Who I really am? Marcus turned to face her, his expression hard. I don't even know who you are anymore. The words hit Naomi like a physical blow. She stood up, her whole body shaking. Then maybe you never did. Across town in their modest home, Rachel sat in her favorite reading chair, watching David pace the living room. Their baby slept peacefully in the nursery, unaware of the storm brewing between his parents. You kept pushing for answers, Rachel, David said, his voice hollow and distant. Now we have them, and nothing is the same. He stopped pacing, running his hands through his hair in frustration. Rachel's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Are you saying this is my fault? Her voice was barely above a whisper. David's shoulders slumped. He looked tired, defeated. I don't know what I'm saying anymore. He sank into the couch, avoiding her gaze. The silence stretched between them like an endless chasm. Rachel's heart pounded as she gathered the courage to ask the question that terrified her most. Do you still love me? David didn't answer right away. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to grow louder with each passing second. The silence was suffocating, filling the room with unspoken fears and doubts. Back in Naomi's apartment, Marcus grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. I need space. His words fell heavy in the room. Naomi watched him, her face a mask of pain and determination. If you walk out that door... But Marcus was already turning the doorknob. In Rachel's home, David stood up from the couch, his movements slow and deliberate. I think I should stay with my brother for a while. He wouldn't meet Rachel's eyes as he headed for the stairs. "David, please," Rachel's voice broke. "We can work through this." But David was already climbing the stairs to pack a bag. Both men walked away, leaving their wives alone with their pain and uncertainty. The sound of closing doors echoed through both homes like final punctuation marks on chapters of their lives that were ending too soon. Naomi collapsed onto her couch while across town, Rachel curled into herself in her chair. Their worlds, once so certain and intertwined, now seemed to be crumbling around them, leaving them to face an uncertain future neither had ever imagined. The nursery was bathed in moonlight, casting soft shadows across the pale yellow walls. Rachel had just settled into the rocking chair, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, when a weak cry pierced the quiet. Something about the sound made her heart skip. It wasn't her son's usual cry. She rushed to the crib, her bare feet silent on the carpet. Her baby boy lay there, his dark curls damp with sweat, his tiny face scrunched in discomfort. When she touched his forehead, fear shot through her body. "Naomi!" Her voice cracked with panic. "Something's wrong!" Footsteps thundered down the hallway as Naomi appeared in the doorway, her hair messy from trying to sleep on the couch. One look at Rachel's face, and she was across the room in seconds. "He's burning up," Rachel whispered, her hands shaking as she lifted her son. The baby's breathing seemed labored, coming in short, irregular gasps. Naomi pressed her hand to the baby's forehead, her eyes widening. "His breathing doesn't sound right, Rachel." Rachel was already reaching for her phone. "I'm calling the hospital." Her fingers trembled so badly she could barely dial the numbers. The drive to the emergency room was a blur of streetlights and terror. Rachel sat in the back seat with her baby while Naomi drove, breaking every speed limit. The baby's cries had grown weaker, which somehow scared Rachel even more. At the hospital, everything moved too fast and too slow at the same time. Nurses whisked the baby away, placing him in a tiny hospital bed that made him look even smaller. Rachel watched, helpless, as they attached wires to his little arms and legs. Each beep of the monitors seemed to echo in her head. Naomi's hand found hers, squeezing tight. They stood together, watching through the glass as doctors moved around her son with urgent efficiency. When the doctor finally approached, his face was serious enough to make Rachel's knees weak. "Mrs. Bennett, we need to talk." Rachel gripped Naomi's hand harder. "Is he okay?" The doctor's expression grew grimmer. "Your son has a rare blood disorder. We've run several tests, and the results are conclusive." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Rachel felt Naomi's arm wrap around her waist, holding her steady. "What does that mean?" Rachel's voice sounded far away to her own ears. "What can we do?" The doctor sighed, his clipboard lowering. "He needs a bone marrow transplant, and we need to find a match immediately. Without it..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Rachel's legs gave out. Naomi caught her as she crumpled, lowering them both to the cold hospital floor. Sobs racked Rachel's body as she pressed her face into her sister's shoulder. "What if we lose him?" The words came out between gasps, raw with fear. Naomi's arms tightened around her, her own voice thick with tears. "We won't," she whispered fiercely. "We'll find a way." Through the glass, the monitors continued their steady beeping, marking each precious moment of her baby's life. The fluorescent lights of the pediatric intensive care unit cast a harsh glow over everything, making Rachel's exhausted face look even more pale. She sat beside her baby's crib, watching his tiny chest rise and fall, each breath accompanied by the steady beeping of monitors. Clear tubes snaked from his arms, delivering vital fluids and medications. Naomi paced nearby, her phone clutched in her hand, dark circles under her eyes from a sleepless night. The sisters hadn't left the hospital since rushing in last night, both too afraid to leave the baby alone for even a moment. Dr. Patel, a kind-faced woman with graying hair at her temples, entered the room holding a thick medical file. Her presence made Rachel's heart jump into her throat. "Mrs. Bennett," Dr. Patel said gently, pulling up a chair, "we need to discuss your son's condition." Naomi immediately moved to Rachel's side, gripping her shoulder in support. After running several tests, we've confirmed that your son has diamond blackfan anemia, Dr. Patel explained, her voice steady but serious. It's a rare blood disorder that affects the bone marrow's ability to produce red blood cells. Rachel's fingers twisted in her lap. But you can treat it, right? He needs a bone marrow transplant, Dr. Patel said. And we need to find a match as soon as possible. So we just need a donor, right? Rachel asked, her voice trembling with desperate hope. Dr. Patel's expression softened. Finding a match isn't that simple. Family members are usually the best option, but even then the match needs to be precise. Naomi stepped forward, her jaw set with determination. Then we get tested. We do whatever it takes. Rachel's eyes drifted to the empty chair beside her where David should have been sitting. The space felt like a physical ache in her chest. He hadn't answered any of her calls since last night. As if summoned by her thoughts, the door creaked open. David stood there, his clothes wrinkled, his face unshaven. Guilt was written across his features as he met Rachel's gaze. "Where were you?" Rachel's voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. David took a hesitant step forward, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I didn't know what to do, but I'm here now." Dr. Patel cleared her throat, drawing their attention back to the urgent matter at hand. "You both need to be tested immediately," she said, looking between Rachel and David. "If neither of you are a match, we need to look further before it's too late." The word "too late" hung in the air like a physical threat. Rachel looked down at her baby boy, so small and vulnerable in the hospital crib. His dark curls stuck to his forehead, and despite everything, he looked peaceful in his sleep. "How soon can we start the testing?" Naomi asked, already rolling up her sleeve. "We can begin right away," Dr. Patel replied. "The sooner we find a match, the better his chances." Rachel stood up, wiping tears from her cheeks with trembling hands. She looked at Naomi, determination breaking through her fear. "We find a match, no matter what." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the hospital waiting room as Naomi paced back and forth. Rachel sat hunched in an uncomfortable plastic chair, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. The room smelled of antiseptic and coffee, and the quiet murmur of other worried families created a constant backdrop of anxiety. Marcus walked in, his work boots leaving muddy prints on the pristine floor. His eyes found Naomi first, then darted away. Despite their problems, he'd come when she called about the baby. He stood awkwardly by the wall, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Thank you for coming," Naomi said softly. He nodded, still not meeting her eyes. "How's the baby?" "Stable for now," Rachel answered, her voice rough from crying. "But we need these test results." David sat 3 chairs away from Rachel, his tie loosened and shirt wrinkled. The distance between them felt like miles, even though they were waiting for news about their son together. The door opened and Dr. Patel entered, clutching a manila folder. His face was carefully neutral, but something in his posture made Naomi's heart sink. "I have the results of the bone marrow compatibility tests," he said, pulling out several papers. Rachel grabbed David's arm instinctively. For a moment, their problems disappeared in the face of their shared fear. Dr. Patel cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, neither of you are a match." Rachel's gasp echoed in the quiet room. Her grip on David's arm tightened, and he didn't pull away. Naomi leaned forward, hope still burning in her chest. "What about me?" Dr. Patel hesitated, shuffling the papers in his hands. "You're not a match either." "That doesn't make sense," Naomi said, standing up. "I'm her twin." The words died in her throat as realization crashed over her. All those years of looking alike, finishing each other's sentences, sharing everything, it had all been a coincidence. Rachel's voice came out barely above a whisper. "You're not my twin." Dr. Patel nodded solemnly. "We need to expand our search. Do you have any other blood relatives we can test?" The room fell silent. Naomi's mind raced, memories flashing through her head. The visit to Esther Collins, the envelope with a name and address, the truth about her birth. She spun around to face Rachel. "Esther," she breathed. Rachel looked up, understanding dawning on her tear-stained face. Your biological family. If we find them, we might find a match. Marcus pushed off from the wall, frowning. The woman from Atlanta? Yes, Naomi said, already pulling out her phone. I know where to find her. Her hands shook as she held the phone, the piece of paper with Esther Johnson's address crumpled in her other hand. The last name that had seemed like just words on paper yesterday now held the possibility of saving her nephew's life. Rachel stood up, wiping her eyes. We have to try. We have to find them. David finally spoke, his voice hoarse. How do we even know if they'll help? They will, Naomi said firmly, though her heart pounded with uncertainty. They have to. She looked down at her phone, at the name and address that could change everything. Her biological mother was out there somewhere in Atlanta, living a life completely unaware that her long-lost daughter was about to come crashing back into her world, asking for help to save a baby she'd never met. The modest ranch house sat quietly on a tree-lined street in Atlanta, its faded blue paint and overgrown rose bushes telling stories of years gone by. Naomi's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, staring at the house number that matched the one she'd scribbled down. Rachel squeezed her sister's shoulder. We can do this. They walked up the cracked concrete path past wind chimes that tinkled softly in the Georgia breeze. Naomi's heart pounded with each step. This was more than just finding a donor. This was meeting the mother she never knew she had. The doorbell echoed inside. Footsteps approached and the door creaked open. Esther Johnson stood there, her silver hair neatly styled, wearing a floral blouse and pressed slacks. The moment her eyes landed on Naomi, her hand flew to her mouth. Naomi! Naomi tried to speak, but her voice cracked. We need your help. Esther's eyes filled with tears as she ushered them inside. The living room was cluttered but cozy, filled with family photos and handmade quilts. A younger woman sat in an armchair, watching them with wary eyes. Anita, Naomi's biological sister. Mom, what's going on? Anita's voice was sharp with suspicion. Esther guided Naomi and Rachel to the sofa. Family photos covered every surface, moments of a life Naomi had never known. She spotted herself in Anita's features. The same nose, the same way of holding their heads. My sister's baby is very sick, Naomi began, her voice shaking. He needs a bone marrow transplant. We've all been tested, but none of us are a match. She looked at Esther, then Anita. You're my biological family. You might be able to save him. Esther sank into her chair, pressing her hand against her heart. Of course we'll help, whatever you need. But Anita stood up, crossing her arms. Wait a minute, we just found out about you. How do we know this isn't some kind of scam? Anita? Esther's voice was sharp. Rachel leaned forward, her eyes pleading. My baby will die without this transplant. I know this is overwhelming, but please, we're desperate. Anita's expression softened slightly as she looked at Rachel's tear-stained face. We don't even know if we're a match. Then let's find out, Rachel said quietly. Please. Esther stood up, her movements decisive despite her age. We'll get tested today, all of us. She looked at Anita. This is your sister, whether you're ready to accept that or not. And that baby is your family too. Anita uncrossed her arms, sighing. Fine, I'll do it. The tension in the room eased slightly. Naomi looked around at these strangers who shared her blood, these people who might hold the key to saving her nephew's life. The weight of 32 years of separation hung heavy in the air. Esther moved to sit beside Naomi on the sofa. She took Naomi's hands in hers, her grip warm and firm. Her eyes were filled with tears, but her voice was steady. No matter what happens, you're my daughter, and we'll do everything we can. Naomi felt the truth of those words deep in her bones. In this moment, surrounded by photos of a life she never knew, she realized that family wasn't just about blood or birth. It was about showing up when it mattered most. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the hospital's surgical wing, casting harsh shadows across the worn vinyl chairs. Rachel sat with her head in her hands, her wedding ring catching the light as she twisted it nervously. David stood by the window, his shoulders tense, staring out at nothing in particular. The distance between them felt like miles, even though they shared the same worry for their son. Naomi couldn't sit still. She paced the length of the waiting room, her shoes making soft squeaking sounds against the polished floor. Every few minutes, she'd glance at the clock, then at the double doors leading to the surgical suite, then back at the clock again. Anita sat quietly in a corner chair, already dressed in a hospital gown. Her dark curls were pulled back in a neat bun, and despite her attempt to appear nonchalant, her fingers drummed steadily against the armrest. She'd only known Naomi for 2 days, but here she was, ready to undergo surgery for a nephew she'd just met. "Mrs. Bennett?" Dr. Patel's voice cut through the tense silence. Everyone's heads snapped up as he entered, clipboard in hand. Rachel stood shakily, David moving to stand behind her. "Yes?" The doctor's face softened as he looked at Rachel. "We have a match." The words hung in the air for a moment before Rachel's breath came out in a sharp exhale. "Who?" Dr. Patel turned toward Anita. "Your biological sister." Naomi's hands flew to her mouth as tears sprang to her eyes. She rushed to Anita, wrapping her arms around her newfound sister. Anita, trying to maintain her tough exterior, gave an awkward pat on Naomi's back. "It's what family does, right?" Anita mumbled, but her voice wavered slightly. The surgical team began their preparations, wheeling in equipment and checking monitors. A nurse approached Anita with pre-op forms, while another prepared the surgical site. The organized chaos of medical personnel moving with purpose filled the room. Rachel stood by her baby's crib, her finger caught in his tiny grip. His skin was pale, making the medical tubes and wires seem even more stark against his dark skin. "Hold on, baby," she whispered, bending down to kiss his forehead. "We're going to fix this." David watched from a few feet away, his face a mix of guilt and concern. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, until he stood beside Rachel. Without a word, he placed his hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. Anita lay back on the gurney as the anesthesiologist explained the procedure. Naomi held her hand, struggling to find the right words. "Thank you," she finally managed. "I know we barely know each other, but—" "Stop," Anita interrupted, squeezing Naomi's hand. "Maybe we didn't grow up together, but we're still sisters, and that little boy needs help. It's that simple." The surgical team began wheeling Anita toward the operating room. Rachel reached out and caught her hand as she passed. "I'll never be able to repay you for this." Anita managed a small smile. "Just make sure my nephew grows up strong enough to play basketball. I've got a mean jump shot to teach him." The surgical doors swung open with a soft whoosh. As they wheeled Anita through, Naomi and Rachel found themselves standing side by side, watching the doors close behind her. The waiting room fell into tense silence, broken only by the steady tick of the wall clock and the distant sounds of hospital activity. Rachel reached for Naomi's hand, gripping it tightly. Now all they could do was wait. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the hospital waiting room, casting a harsh glow that made everyone look sickly and worn. Rachel couldn't sit still, her shoes making soft squeaking sounds against the linoleum floor as she paced back and forth. Every few steps, she'd glance at the clock on the wall, then at the double doors leading to surgery, as if willing them to open. Naomi sat perfectly still in one of the uncomfortable chairs, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her face was a mask of concentration, like she was trying to send strength through the walls to both her newfound sister and her nephew. David hunched forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, head buried in his hands. His wedding ring caught the light occasionally, a reminder of promises made and nearly broken. The weight of his recent actions pressed heavily on his shoulders. The quiet was broken only by the occasional announcement over the hospital PA system and the distant sounds of nurses going about their duties. Each minute felt like an hour, stretching endlessly into the uncertain future. A movement by the window caught Rachel's attention. Marcus stood there, hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking like he wasn't sure if he should stay or go. His presence was unexpected, and Naomi's sharp intake of breath showed she hadn't expected him either. David finally lifted his head, his voice rough with emotion. I should have been here sooner." Rachel paused in her pacing but didn't turn to look at him. Her voice was quiet but firm. "But you weren't." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with hurt and disappointment. David nodded slowly, accepting the truth of it. Naomi turned to Marcus, her expression guarded. "Why are you here?" Marcus shifted his weight, one hand coming up to rub at his jaw, a nervous habit she knew well. His eyes met hers, full of regret and something else. "Because I still care about you, Naomi." The tension in the room shifted, becoming something different, something more complex. Before Naomi could respond, the double doors swung open, and Dr. Patel walked out, still wearing his surgical cap. His face showed exhaustion, but his composure was steady and professional. Everyone froze, holding their breath as he approached. Rachel's hands trembled as she stepped forward, David rising to stand behind her, close but not touching. Dr. Patel looked at each of them in turn, his expression carefully neutral. "The transplant was successful. Now we wait." Relief flooded the room, but it was tentative, cautious. They all knew this was just the first step in a longer journey. A few minutes later, Rachel and Naomi stood in the PICU, looking down at the tiny form in the hospital crib. The baby looked even smaller, surrounded by machines and monitors. Each beep and flash a reminder of how precarious the situation still was. Tubes and wires seemed to sprout from everywhere, but underneath it all was just a small boy fighting for his life. Rachel reached through the opening in the side of the crib, her finger gently stroking her son's tiny hand. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but filled with fierce determination. "We're not giving up on you." The hospital cafeteria was eerily quiet in the early morning hours, with only the soft hum of the coffee machine and occasional clink of metal trays breaking the silence. Pale sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. Naomi and Rachel sat at a corner table, two untouched cups of coffee growing cold between them. Rachel's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, her eyes heavy from lack of sleep. The past 24 hours felt like a lifetime, filled with beeping monitors and anxious glances at medical charts. Her baby boy was fighting for his life upstairs, and here she sat, feeling helpless despite the successful transplant. Naomi watched her sister with concern, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands. The weight of everything, the switched births, the family secrets, and now this medical crisis, seemed to press down on both of them like a physical force. "Do you think he's going to be okay?" Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper, fragile with fear and hope. Naomi reached across the table, taking her sister's hand in hers. The gesture felt natural, familiar, a reminder that some bonds transcended biology. "He's a fighter, just like you." A shadow fell across their table, and both women looked up to see Marcus standing there, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He looked as exhausted as they felt, his usually neat appearance rumpled from what had clearly been a sleepless night. "Can we talk?" His voice was rough with emotion, his eyes fixed on Naomi. Naomi's jaw tightened slightly. "What do you want, Marcus?" He pulled out a chair and sat down, his shoulders hunched forward. The morning light highlighted the stubble on his face and the creases in his shirt. "I didn't handle things well." "You left." Naomi's words were sharp, but her voice trembled slightly. The hurt was still fresh, still raw. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "I know, and I regret it." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "When everything happened, the babies, the switch, finding out about your real mother, I couldn't process it. But that's no excuse for walking away when you needed me most." Rachel watched the exchange silently, her hand still clasped in her sister's. She could feel the tension radiating between them, years of love and trust hanging in the balance. "You doubted me," Naomi said quietly. "You actually thought I would—" She couldn't finish the sentence, the pain of his accusation still too fresh. "I was scared," Marcus admitted. "Everything I thought I knew was suddenly different. But I was wrong, Naomi. So wrong." His voice cracked slightly. "Watching you these past few days, seeing how you've been there for Rachel and the baby, you're still the same amazing woman I married." Naomi stared into her coffee cup, tears threatening to spill over. The morning light caught the gold band on her finger, a reminder of promises made and nearly broken. Rachel squeezed her sister's hand gently, offering silent support. The cafeteria had begun to fill with early morning staff, their quiet conversations creating a gentle backdrop to this moment of truth between husband and wife. Naomi finally looked up at Marcus, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet." Marcus nodded, accepting her words with quiet resignation. "I'm not asking for that. Just don't shut me out completely." The evening shadows stretched across Naomi's apartment, creating dark corners that matched her somber mood. Her suitcase sat untouched by the door, still packed with wrinkled clothes from the hospital stay. The apartment felt different now, emptier somehow, as if the weight of recent events had carved out spaces where certainty used to live. Naomi sat on her couch, arms wrapped around herself, staring at nothing in particular. The soft ticking of the wall clock filled the silence, marking time in steady beats that felt both too fast and too slow. Her phone lay face down on the coffee table, ignored since she'd gotten home. The knock startled her, 3 hesitant taps that she immediately recognized as Marcus's. Her heart did that familiar flip it always did when he was near, followed by the newer, sharper sting of hurt. She stood slowly, smoothing her shirt more out of habit than necessity. When she opened the door, Marcus stood there looking as uncertain as she felt. His usual confident posture was replaced by something more humble, his shoulders slightly hunched, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Naomi crossed her arms, creating a barrier between them. "What do you want?" Marcus exhaled, the sound heavy with regret. "I know I don't deserve a second chance." "You don't," Naomi agreed, her voice firm but not cruel. Despite her words, she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Marcus moved past her, his familiar cologne bringing back a rush of memories she wasn't ready to deal with. They sat down, the coffee table between them like a neutral zone. Naomi studied his face, looking for signs of the man who had walked out on her during the hardest moment of her life. Instead, she saw shadows under his eyes and worry lines that hadn't been there before. Marcus rubbed his hands together, a nervous gesture she'd seen 1,000 times before. "I started seeing a therapist," he said quietly, "trying to understand why I reacted the way I did." Naomi raised an eyebrow, surprise momentarily replacing her guarded expression. "And?" Marcus met her gaze directly, his eyes clear and honest. "Because I was afraid. Afraid that I had built my life on something that wasn't real." The words hung between them, heavy with truth. Naomi felt her throat tighten, remembering how lost she'd felt when she'd first learned about her own identity. "And now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus reached across the space between them, his hand extended palm up, an offering, not a demand. "Now I realized the only thing that wasn't real was my fear." Naomi looked at his outstretched hand, remembering all the times it had held hers, supported her, comforted her. She thought about the past few weeks, the accusations, the silence, the empty bed, and the even emptier explanations. She exhaled slowly, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. "One step at a time, Marcus." He nodded, relief and understanding mixing in his expression. "That's all I'm asking for." The hospital corridor buzzed with its usual quiet activity as Rachel sat beside her baby's crib, her fingers gently wrapped around his tiny hand. The steady beeping of monitors had become a familiar rhythm over the past week, but today felt different. Naomi stood beside her, both sisters watching the rise and fall of the baby's chest with careful attention. Dr. Patel entered the room, his footsteps soft against the linoleum floor. He moved deliberately to check the monitors, his experienced eyes scanning the numbers and graphs. The silence stretched as he made notes on his tablet, each moment making Rachel's heart beat faster. Finally, he turned to face them, and something in his expression made Rachel's breath catch. There was a warmth in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "Your son is responding well," Dr. Patel said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "His numbers are improving." Rachel's fingers tightened around her baby's hand. "You mean?" The doctor's smile widened, genuine and reassuring. "He's going to be okay." The words hit Rachel like a wave, breaking through every wall she'd built to protect herself from hope. She collapsed forward, sobbing, her tears falling onto the baby's blanket as she clutched him close. All the fear, all the sleepless nights, all the prayers, they hadn't been in vain. Naomi wiped at her own eyes, watching her sister and nephew with a trembling smile. "You did it, little guy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The sound of footsteps made them look up. David stood in the doorway, his face tight with concern as he saw Rachel crying. "Rachel?" His voice carried all the worry and guilt of the past weeks. Rachel looked up at him, tears still streaming down her face. "He's okay, David," she managed between sobs. "He's okay." David took a hesitant step forward, his eyes fixed on his son. The emotion raw on his face spoke volumes about his regret, his fear, and his love. "Can I hold him?" Rachel nodded, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, she watched as David carefully lifted their son from the crib. His hands trembled slightly as he cradled the baby, studying the tiny features of their child's face. The moment felt sacred, like the first real step toward healing. Naomi watched the scene unfold, her heart swelling with hope. The past weeks had been a nightmare of uncertainty and fear, but here, in this moment, she could see the first real signs of their family coming back together. David's gentle handling of his son, the way Rachel's eyes softened as she watched them, the peaceful expression on the baby's face. It all spoke of survival, of love persisting despite everything. Dr. Patel quietly excused himself, leaving the family to their moment of reunion. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the scene. After a while, Naomi touched Rachel's shoulder. "Let's get some air." Rachel nodded, following her sister out of the room and into the hospital garden. The fresh air felt cleansing after so many days in the sterile hospital environment. Naomi looked up at the sky, taking in the scattered clouds and patches of blue. "You know what, Rachel?" Rachel wiped the remaining tears from her cheeks. "What?" Naomi smiled, genuine and bright. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like everything's going to be okay." The afternoon sun filtered through the hospital window, casting a warm glow across the pediatric ward. Rachel sat in the now familiar chair beside her son's crib, her eyes fixed on his peaceful, sleeping face. The steady rise and fall of his tiny chest brought her more comfort than she could express. The machines that had once seemed so threatening now hummed quietly in the background, a gentle reminder that they were on the other side of the storm. Naomi stood by the window, her arms crossed, watching her sister with a mixture of relief and pride. The past few weeks had changed them all, but Rachel's strength had been remarkable. Even when everything seemed to be falling apart, she'd never given up hope. Rachel's fingers ghosted over her son's tiny hand, marveling at how much stronger he looked already. The color had returned to his cheeks, and his breathing was steady and strong. "He looks stronger," Rachel whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Naomi moved closer, placing a gentle hand on her sister's shoulder. "Because he is," she said softly. Then, with a knowing look at Rachel, she added, "So are you." The sound of footsteps made them both look up. David stood in the doorway, his posture uncertain, his eyes fixed on his wife and child. He'd changed in the past weeks, too. The circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and his usual confident stance was replaced with something more hesitant. He cleared his throat softly, and Rachel looked up, surprise flickering across her face. They hadn't been alone together since before the transplant, both too focused on their son's recovery to address the growing distance between them. David took a small step into the room, his hands fidgeting at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the peaceful atmosphere. "I know I haven't been the best husband through all of this." Rachel's eyes darkened slightly. memories of his doubt and distance washing over her, the lonely nights, the questioning looks, the way he'd pulled away when she'd needed him most. "No, you haven't," she agreed, her voice steady but tinged with hurt. David moved closer to the crib, his eyes moving between Rachel and their son. "But I want to be better," he continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "I want to be here. For both of you." Rachel studied him for a long moment, taking in the sincerity in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the crib. She'd seen him make promises before, heard words of commitment and love, but this time felt different. There was a rawness to his voice, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Words aren't enough, David," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "I need action." David nodded, accepting her challenge without hesitation. "Then let me prove it," he said, his voice steady and sure. The room fell silent except for the soft beeping of monitors and their son's gentle breathing. David slowly moved his hand forward, placing it carefully over Rachel's where it rested on their son's blanket. Their fingers touched, both connecting to their child, and in that moment something shifted between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Naomi watched from her place by the window as her sister and brother-in-law shared this quiet moment. She could see the long road ahead of them, knew there would be more conversations, more tears, more healing needed, but for now this silent promise seemed like enough of a start. David stirred his coffee endlessly, watching the dark liquid swirl in his cup. The hospital cafeteria was quiet at this hour, with only a few tired nurses grabbing quick meals between shifts. Through the large windows, city lights twinkled like distant stars, creating a peaceful backdrop that contrasted sharply with the tension at their small table. Rachel sat across from him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She hadn't touched her own coffee, and her face held that careful mask she'd worn since everything fell apart. The silence between them felt heavy, loaded with all the words they hadn't said. Finally, David took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he set down his spoon. "I wasn't just scared about the baby's condition, Rachel." Rachel frowned, her eyebrows drawing together. "Then what was it?" David looked away, focusing on a spot somewhere beyond the window. His shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible weight. "When I saw our son, when I saw his skin was different." He paused, swallowing hard. "I panicked. Not because I thought you cheated, but because I realized how much I didn't understand about my own biases." Rachel's jaw tightened and he could see the hurt flash across her face. "You thought he wouldn't be yours in the ways that mattered." "I had this idea of what our family would look like," David admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "And when reality was different, I didn't know how to handle it." He ran a hand through his hair, looking older and more tired than Rachel had ever seen him. "I was so caught up in my own confusion that I forgot what really mattered." Rachel shook her head, tears gathering in her eyes. "David, our son needed you and you ran." Her voice cracked slightly. "Do you know what that felt like? To watch you pull away when we needed you most?" David gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "I know, and I will regret that for the rest of my life." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly for the first time. "I failed both of you. I let my fears and prejudices control me instead of facing them head-on." Rachel studied him carefully, searching his face. Her expression softened slightly, but the wariness remained. "I want to believe you, David. But trust, it takes time to rebuild." She took a shaky breath. "You broke something between us when you walked away." David nodded, accepting her words like physical blows. "Then let me start today." He leaned forward, his voice earnest. "I want to be the father our son deserves, the husband you deserve. I know I can't erase what I did, but I can work every day to be better." Rachel sat quietly for a long moment, processing his words. The sounds of the cafeteria seemed to fade away as she considered everything he'd said. Finally, she reached across the table and took his hand. Her touch was hesitant but real. "We take it slow." David squeezed her hand gently, relief washing over his features. As slow as you need. His voice was thick with emotion. Thank you for giving me this chance. The morning rain created a gentle rhythm against Naomi's windows, matching the uncertain beating of her heart. She sat on her gray couch, fingers absently tracing the fabric pattern, while Marcus stood near the door, his presence both familiar and strange. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words and lingering hurt. Marcus shifted his weight, his work boots squeaking against the hardwood floor. His face showed the strain of sleepless nights, dark circles under his eyes matching the shadows in his expression. I shouldn't have left, he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. Naomi crossed her arms tight against her chest, a defensive gesture she'd perfected over the past few weeks. No, you shouldn't have. The words came out sharp, carrying the weight of lonely nights and unanswered calls. Marcus sighed, running his fingers through his disheveled hair. But I need you to know I left because I was scared of losing you, not because I didn't love you. His eyes held a desperate sincerity that made Naomi's chest tighten. You have a funny way of showing love, Marcus. Naomi's laugh held no humor, just pain. She watched him flinch at her words, noticed how his shoulders slumped slightly. He rubbed his hand over his face, a gesture so familiar it made her heart ache. I needed time to figure out how to be the man you deserve. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Naomi felt her anger soften despite herself. And did you? She hated how hopeful her voice sounded, how much she wanted to believe him. Marcus met her eyes, his gaze steady and clear. I don't have all the answers, but I know one thing. I can't imagine a life without you in it. The raw honesty in his voice made her breath catch. Taking a cautious step forward, Marcus spread his hands in a gesture of openness. Just tell me what you need from me. The morning light caught the silver wedding band he still wore, and Naomi's eyes fixed on it for a moment. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with determination. I need honesty. I need stability. Her voice grew stronger with each word. I need to know that when things get hard, you won't walk away again. Marcus nodded, his expression serious. I can give you that if you'll let me. He stood perfectly still, waiting for her response, looking more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. The rain continued its gentle pattern against the windows as Naomi considered his words. Everything in her wanted to believe him, to trust that he meant what he said. But the memory of his absence still stung fresh in her mind. Finally, she whispered, one step at a time. Marcus exhaled deeply, relief washing over his features. That's all I ask. His voice was barely louder than the rain, filled with gratitude and promise. The afternoon sun filtered through the pale blue curtains of the nursery, casting soft shadows across the newly painted walls. Rachel stood by the white wooden crib, her movements gentle and precise as she lowered her son onto the fresh cotton sheets. The mobile above his head swayed slightly, tiny stars and moons dancing in the warm light. David lingered in the doorway, his shoulder pressed against the frame, watching his wife and son with a mixture of love and regret in his eyes. The past few weeks had aged him. New lines creased his forehead, and his usual confident posture held a hint of uncertainty. Rachel smoothed the soft blanket over their sleeping son, her fingers lingering on the delicate fabric. He's finally home, she whispered, her voice catching slightly. The words held the weight of endless hospital hours, beeping monitors and desperate prayers. David smiled, taking a tentative step into the room. Yeah, he is. His voice was soft, matching the peaceful atmosphere of the nursery. The floorboard creaked beneath his feet, and they both held their breath, but their son slept on, peaceful and strong. Rachel's hand rested on the crib rail as she stared down at their miracle. I forgot what this felt like, she admitted, her eyes never leaving their baby's face. The simple comfort of having him home, safe in his own room, felt almost foreign after weeks of hospital machinery and medical staff. David moved closer, close enough to reach for her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, warm and hesitant. We've been through hell, Rachel, but we made it. His words carried the weight of their shared trauma, the shock of discovery, the fear of loss, the strain of doubt. Rachel turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. Barely. The word hung between them, heavy with unspoken pain. The memory of his absence during those critical first days still lingered, a shadow over their relationship. David nodded, accepting her hurt without defense. But we're still here. His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, a gesture of comfort they'd shared countless times before everything changed. Rachel studied him, really looked at him, taking in the sincerity in his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way he held himself, like a man afraid of making another mistake. Do you really want to be? Her question was direct, stripped of pretense. David released her hand only to take both of hers in his, turning to face her fully. More than anything. His voice carried a conviction that hadn't been there before, strengthened by the lessons of near loss. The afternoon light caught the moisture in his eyes, making them shine with unshed tears. Rachel let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she nodded. The gesture was small but significant, an acknowledgement of his words, a tiny step toward rebuilding what they'd almost lost. Their son made a small sound in his sleep, drawing both their gazes. He looked peaceful, unaware of the emotional moment passing between his parents. His tiny chest rose and fell steadily, each breath a reminder of his strength, of the miracle that brought them all back together. One day at a time, Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft whir of the ceiling fan. David leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. One day at a time, he echoed, his words a promise and a prayer wrapped into one. Naomi stood on Esther's doorstep, her hand frozen mid-air before knocking. The Atlanta heat pressed against her skin, but that wasn't why her palms were sweating. This moment felt bigger than she could process, meeting her biological mother not in crisis but by choice. The house looked exactly as she remembered from their rushed visit during the baby's emergency, a modest 2-story with faded blue shutters and overflowing flower boxes. Wind chimes tinkled softly in the breeze, their gentle music doing little to calm her racing heart. Taking a deep breath, she finally knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as if Esther had been waiting nearby. Her biological mother stood there, hope and uncertainty dancing across her face. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and she wore a simple floral dress that somehow made her look both elegant and approachable. "I didn't know if you'd come," Esther said softly, her voice catching slightly. Naomi managed a small smile. "Neither did I." Esther stepped aside, gesturing for Naomi to enter. The living room was cozy, filled with comfortable furniture and family photos. Naomi's eyes caught on a particular frame, a baby picture that could have been her, but wasn't. It was the daughter Esther had raised, thinking she was her own. They sat together on the worn floral couch, an old photo album between them. Esther's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. "This was my first day home from the hospital," she said, pointing to a photo of herself holding a baby. "I remember thinking how perfect you were, how blessed I felt." Her voice cracked. "I didn't know then that you weren't in my arms." Naomi swallowed hard. "What was I like? As a baby, I mean, what did the nurses tell you?" Tears welled in Esther's eyes as she spoke. "They said you were strong, that you had the loudest cry they'd ever heard." She laughed softly. "I always imagined you'd be fierce and independent." "And was I?" Naomi asked, her own eyes growing wet. Esther shook her head. "I never got to find out, but looking at you now, I think they were right." She wiped her eyes. "I always felt like I was missing something. Now I know. I was missing you." Naomi felt her chest tighten. This was the moment she'd been both longing for and dreading. "I have a family already," she said carefully. "A sister. A mother who raised me." "I know," Esther nodded, understanding in her eyes. "And I would never try to take their place. But if you'll have me..." She hesitated, then continued, "I'd like to be part of your life." Naomi reached up to wipe away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I think I want that too." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, letting the weight of their words settle around them. The wind chimes continued their gentle song outside, and somewhere in the house, a clock ticked steadily forward. Esther reached out, gently taking Naomi's hands in hers. Her touch was warm, maternal in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. "No matter where life takes you," she said softly, "you'll always have a home here." Naomi looked into her biological mother's eyes and saw decades of love, loss, and hope reflected back at her. For the first time since learning the truth about her birth, she felt something inside her shift and settle. "Maybe," she said, squeezing Esther's hands, "it's time I start believing that." The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of Margaret's house as Naomi stood at the front door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The familiar scent of her mother's pot roast wafted through the air, bringing back a flood of childhood memories. Her stomach twisted with anxiety, but she knew this conversation couldn't wait any longer. Inside, Margaret was exactly where Naomi expected her to be. At the old oak dining table, a cup of steaming tea between her weathered hands. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, and her kind eyes watched Naomi with a mixture of love and concern. "I wondered when you'd come," Margaret said softly, her fingers wrapped around the ceramic mug. Naomi shifted her weight from one foot to the other, suddenly feeling like a little girl again. "I didn't know if I should." Margaret gestured to the chair across from her, the same chair where Naomi had sat for countless family dinners, homework sessions, and heart-to-heart talks. "Just because you know where you came from doesn't mean you don't belong here." Naomi sank into the familiar wooden chair, her eyes fixed on the table's worn surface. She traced a small scratch with her finger, one she'd made herself when she was 7, trying to carve her initials with a fork. "I was afraid you'd think I was replacing you." Margaret reached across the table, her warm hand covering Naomi's fidgeting fingers. "Sweetheart, you could have 10 mothers, and I'd still be the one who raised you." Her voice was steady, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I don't want to lose you," Naomi whispered, her voice cracking. The words felt inadequate to express the storm of emotions in her chest. Margaret's grip tightened. "Then don't." The simple response hung in the air between them. Naomi looked up, really looked at the woman who had bandaged her scraped knees, celebrated her victories, and held her through every heartbreak. The woman who had chosen her, raised her, loved her unconditionally. "I've been so confused," Naomi admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Meeting Esther, learning about where I came from. It's like everything I knew about myself got turned upside down." Margaret nodded, understanding in her eyes. "That's natural, sweetheart. Finding out about Esther doesn't erase our history. It doesn't change the fact that you're my daughter." "But what if," Naomi's voice caught, "what if I want to know her too? What if I want her in my life?" "Then you get to have both," Margaret said firmly. "Love isn't a finite resource, Naomi. Having more of it doesn't mean you have to take it from somewhere else." Tears spilled down Naomi's cheeks. She stood up abruptly, circling the table to collapse against her mother's shoulder. Margaret's arms wrapped around her immediately, familiar and safe. "You will always be my daughter," Margaret murmured, stroking Naomi's hair just like she had done countless times before. Her touch was gentle, comforting, unchanged by the revelations that had shaken their world. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park's green expanse as laughter filled the warm spring air. Rachel and Naomi sat on a checkered blanket, watching their babies play with colorful toys scattered around them. The past 6 months had changed everything, yet somehow brought them closer than ever before. David knelt beside his son, his face glowing with pride as he dangled a stuffed elephant above the baby's reaching hands. The doubt that once clouded his eyes was gone, replaced by pure love and devotion. He had kept his promise, showing up every day, proving through actions rather than words that he was committed to his family. Marcus stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, watching Naomi with careful attention. The distance between them had slowly shrunk over the months, but neither rushed to close it completely. Every week he found new ways to show her he meant to stay, bringing her coffee before work, listening when she needed to talk, and showing up giving her space when she asked for it. Under a nearby oak tree, Esther and Margaret sat together on folding chairs, sharing stories and occasional knowing looks. Their initial awkwardness had melted into an unexpected friendship, bound by their shared love for Naomi. "Can you believe where we are now?" Rachel asked, adjusting her son's tiny hat to shield him from the sun. Naomi laughed, shaking her head. "Barely. Sometimes I wake up thinking it was all a dream." David scooped up his son, lifting him high into the air. The baby's delighted giggles echoed across the park, making everyone smile. "Who's my strong boy?" he cooed, bringing him close for a kiss. Marcus caught Naomi watching him and raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Just wondering if you'll survive another 6 months of proving yourself," she teased, but her eyes were soft. He chuckled, moving closer to sit beside her. "I guess we'll see. I'm not going anywhere." Near the oak tree, Esther's voice carried over. "He was always so determined, even as a baby," she was saying to Margaret, who nodded in understanding. "Just like Naomi," Margaret replied warmly. "She never gave up once she set her mind to something." Rachel watched the two women, amazement clear on her face. "I never thought our families would be this blended." "Maybe it was always meant to be," Naomi mused, reaching out to straighten her baby's onesie. The afternoon light turned golden, casting everything in a warm glow. Children played on nearby swings, their laughter mixing with the gentle rustle of leaves. David sat cross-legged beside Rachel, one hand on her back, the other helping their son stand on wobbly legs. Marcus helped pack some of the picnic supplies, his movements careful and deliberate, always aware of Naomi's gaze. He had learned patience over the past months, understanding that trust, once broken, needed time to heal. Esther and Margaret had moved their chairs closer to the blanket, their conversation flowing easily now. They shared knowing looks when the babies did something cute, their grandmother hearts completely in sync despite their different paths to this moment. Naomi watched everyone together, feeling a deep sense of contentment settle in her chest. This was what healing looked like, not perfect, not without its rough edges, but real and lasting. She turned to Rachel, her voice soft but sure. "Family isn't just about blood," she whispered. "It's about who stands by you, no matter what." Rachel nodded, squeezing her sister's hand. "And we always will." The afternoon sun streamed through Rachel's windows, casting a warm glow over the birthday decorations. Colorful balloons bobbed gently in the air conditioning, and a giant, "Happy First Birthday" banner stretched across the living room wall. 2 high chairs sat at the head of the table, waiting for the guests of honor. Naomi adjusted her son's tiny bow tie, smoothing down his dark curls. "Can't believe it's been a year already," she said, her voice soft with wonder. Rachel nodded, bouncing her own son on her hip. His golden curls caught the sunlight as he reached for a nearby balloon. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday we were in that hospital room, terrified out of our minds." David appeared behind Rachel, wrapping an arm around her waist. He'd kept his promise over the past year, showing up every day, proving himself through actions rather than words. "But look at him now," he said, tickling his son's chin. "Strong as can be." Marcus walked in carrying a massive cake, decorated with 2 little teddy bears. He'd been working hard to rebuild trust with Naomi, taking things day by day. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was honest now, stronger for having been tested. "Where should I put this?" he asked, and Naomi pointed to the table. "Right between their high chairs," she said. "They should both have a fair shot at destroying it." The doorbell rang, and Rachel opened it to find Dr. Patel standing there, holding 2 wrapped presents. His kind face broke into a wide smile. "I wouldn't miss this for the world," he said, stepping inside. Esther and Margaret arrived together, chatting like old friends. They'd formed an unexpected bond over the past year, united in their love for Naomi and their grandsons. They carried matching photo albums, filled with pictures from the past year. Rachel carefully lifted her son into his high chair, securing the safety belt. "Ready for your first cake, little man?" The baby gurgled happily, already reaching for the frosting. David quickly snapped a photo, capturing the moment of pure joy on his son's face. Naomi settled her own son into the second high chair, her heart swelling as she watched him beam at everyone gathered around. "He made it, Naomi," Rachel said softly, her eyes glistening with tears. Naomi grinned, her own eyes misty. "Of course he did. He's a fighter." Dr. Patel walked over, smiling at the two women. His presence was a reminder of how far they'd come, how much they'd overcome. Naomi reached out to shake his hand. "Thank you. For everything." The doctor nodded, his expression thoughtful. "A year ago, I thought this was just another medical case. But now, I think this was always meant to happen." Rachel squeezed Naomi's hand, emotion thick in her voice. "To family?" Naomi lifted her glass, looking around at the incredible group of people surrounding them. Marcus caught her eye and winked. Esther and Margaret stood together, beaming with grandmother pride. David had his arm around Rachel's waist, more present and devoted than ever. "To family," Naomi echoed, her heart full. They watched as the babies dove into their cakes, frosting quickly covering their faces and hands. Laughter filled the room as tiny fists grabbed handfuls of cake, most of it missing their mouths entirely. Naomi and Rachel sat side by side, watching their sons make the most glorious mess. These babies, who had brought so much joy and healing to their lives, who had survived against the odds and brought their families together in ways they never expected. Naomi whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "No matter what, we made it." Rachel smiled, reaching for her sister's hand, "And we always will." If you enjoyed the story of Naomi, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.